All right. Welcome, everyone, to this year's Tabula Poetica reading series. We are continuing to experiment with this series. That's a euphemism for the behind-the-scenes work, the experimentation. Today's events are live streaming on YouTube, so there are some people watching on YouTube, and YouTube is going to be adding the closed captions for the event. And that's also where you can find an array of video recordings of previous Tabula Poetica readings and talks. We also have a group of students in the Zoom rooms today to create that personalized experience of the events. And for Q&A portions at the end of each event, we can take questions from both audiences. So the Zoom participants can put the questions in the chat, and then the YouTube participants can put questions in the comments, and we'll try to monitor that as well. In addition to today's events this semester, we'll have Chapman University Presidential Fellow Carolyn Forche here, hopefully in person on November 9th. And then also the MFA poetry reading is scheduled for December 14th. And that's sort of our end of year celebration of poetry. I want to acknowledge that this year has been challenging for many of us and continues to be challenging. And I am especially grateful for my colleagues, both faculty and staff in the English department and the Dean's Office of Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for making sure that this series could continue this year. In particular, thank you to Wilkinson College's Director of Operations, Sarah Gordon, and English Department Chair, Joanna Levin. And most especially to English Department Admin, Samantha Delao, who handles all the logistics and the technology behind the scenes for Tabula Poetica. And she's been doing a great job last year and this year. In fact, I don't think she has really done Tabula Poetica pre-pandemic because she joined Chapman University just before the pandemic hit. So before we get started, I also want you to remind you to buy the book. If you enjoy a literary event, whether it's today's event or another literary event in person or online, but especially online, make sure you go and read more work by that writer. And the best way to support that writer and the work is, of course, to buy the book. In the case of today's guest, Ruben Quesada, his latest book is Revelations from Sibling Rivalry Press. So that's Revelations by Sibling Rivalry Press. And it's available through the press or at other bookstores, including the great big Amazon. I welcome Ruben Quesada today. He grew up here in Southern California, and he now lives in Chicago, where I spent my earliest years. He holds both an MFA and a PhD, and now works with Illinois Humanities as part of the many, many, many ways he shapes literary culture and amplifies Latinx poetry. I've gotten to know him recently through the online Mercy Street reading series that he founded, and also through his Poetry Today feature on Kenyon Review's blog. I would highly recommend both of those projects. They're very different projects doing different things to promote poetry in our culture. Last week, my class, which is a group of the incoming MFA students, looked closely at Ruben Quesada's poem For Charlie, which you can all read and hear on the Poetry Foundation website. We noticed first that the margins are pulled in and justified, and the poem lacks punctuation. And these are things you can notice about the poem without actually reading it. You can see that the margins are different than your typical lineated poem, and you can see that there's no punctuation. In reading the poem, we wanted to start talking immediately about the emotional complexity. And I was really tempted to sum that emotional complexity up as grief. But that's not it. The point, I think, in my reading of it is that the absence, the remembering, the intimacy, the joy, the loss cannot be summed up. So instead, as a group, we turned to the language on the page. It was actually on the screen because we were looking at it all together. We turned to a cold sweat and a whippoorwill calling from beyond the ramshackle fence, and the tan turning a tone the color of Tony Tennille, and the chin, the neck, the beards brushing. We noticed that he loved to, that phrase, he loved to, is repeated. And because of the form, so the justified pulled in margins, because of the form on that web page, the two identical phrases, he loved to, sit on top of the other, one on top of the other. And that to me seemed the heart of this poem. And that's the kind of way I think Ruben's poetry draws me in. I feel the emotion, but I'm incredibly drawn into the language. Today, we're going to hear some of Ruben's poems and also hear what he has to say about those poems. In the past, Tabula Poetica has separated out the poetry talk from the poetry reading, but today we're experimenting. And I'm going to turn this over to Ruben so that he can share these poems and his thoughts on these poems. And also then later today at 7:15 Pacific time, we are going to reconvene and have a conversation about his writing life. So this is a standalone talk and also part of this two-part conversation that Tabula Poetica is developing this year. So Ruben, welcome. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to everybody that's here today, and thank you to Tabula and the department and everyone involved in making this happen. I know that it's been a difficult year, and so having access to the arts, I think, is one way to help us through difficult times. And now with technology, it's wonderful that we're able to access the arts globally in this way and to people. I'd like to read some poems to you today that I've been working on. If you've read some of the poems in Revelations or recent poems online, some of them may sound familiar to you. I like to revise my work very heavily, which is probably something that not a lot of people do. I think that there's certainly a point where you have to stop, and I obsess over the language, which is interesting that you mentioned that. The language is so important. Whenever I teach poetry or I'm writing poetry, one of the elements that's particularly of importance to me is music. I'm a big fan of music, just generally. I listen to music a lot. I would prefer to listen to music than watch something on television or on a screen. And so the sound of words down to the use of the vowels and consonants are incredibly important to me. Something that I also really try to integrate into my work is my personal experience. There's this adage that writers like to, or maybe at one point like to share, and that's write what you know. And I think that because we have this seemingly infinitesimal amount of information, or at least access to it, with enough time and energy, you can get to know almost anything. And so a lot of the things that I tend to write about are taken from my own personal life, but I make them askew in some way, these experiences that I've had. And I grew up with a single mother who liked to garden. And so a lot of my work really looks out into the natural world and tries to incorporate that in some way. I have been leaning into that. And I've been doing a lot more research on things that I find in nature, plants, flowers. Place plays a very important role in my poetry. My first collection primarily focused on me growing up in Los Angeles. And as I've gotten older and I've moved around, I've lived in West Texas, I've lived in Central Illinois, now I'm in Chicago. When I was growing up, we moved a lot in the LA area. Before I was 19, I think my mother and I moved a dozen times. It was, it was a kind of an unstable childhood, and that really impacted how I perceive the idea of place or the idea of home. And so you'll find these elements in a lot of the poems that I write. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to read you some poems. I'll read a few poems and then I'll pause to talk a little bit about them. But the first few poems, you'll find a lot of place. You'll find a lot of flowers. I should probably mention this. I was raised Roman Catholic. And so religion plays a big role. If you didn't figure that out from my collection title, Revelations, religion certainly plays a heavy hand in the way I navigate the world and the way I've perceived myself, as religion tends to do. It colors the way we see ourselves in the world and the way we navigate the world. So, excuse me. This is called Honeysuckle. After my man left me to join a Jesuit order in Ireland, I went and met a priest to confess. I have only ever left this planet once, as I slept in a billow of thistles in an empty storefront after losing myself in the middle of the night. An angel appeared and said, "Come with me. Smell the stone roses as they bloom below the windowsill. Taste the sweet coral honeysuckle sap of earth. The smell of Antilles lilies washes over me. A blue field of blue lavender light, lapping like waves at my feet, spins itself into the body of Adam, and the translucent figure of Eve appears. Salmon-colored clouds cleave to seaside olive trees, and just before sunrise, yokeless on the coast, oxen settle at the edge of the sea only to be concerned with themselves. St. Louis for Pontiac, 1714 to 1769. Rising past the Mississippi, the gateway arch is a parabola propelled out of the earth and whose cosine is a complementary angle to the sky. Sunsets are never the same here. Sunsets long and profuse pour onto arable plains. The wind ebbs. Seagrass prairies wave at the moon. A swish of tangerine. Leaves beveled and stained glass abound. A skyline of winged bean, silver and green. River birch rises, heaped and nimbus, cumulonimbus. The river looms, the river flows. I see a dolphin, I see a face. Angels in the Sun. I would have waited alone 1,000 years for the coming of angels, blinding bright as the spring sun to arrive, to abandon this world for another. Stunned by their flashing lights aflame across the bow of their spacecraft, landing lights for that world. Herds of animals, horses and humans and fish fixed. The angels approached. Come angels, come beasts. Men and women cried out to each other. The angels cried. Some were lost between their earthly life and paradise. And what is paradise anyway? Few imagined being bound to this world, extraordinary, ordinary. They rose into a green halo of steam, a crucifix flying into the ruddy gallows of heaven. My mother is a garden. Mom was acquired by the United States long before I was born. Coerced by some American zodiac dream, she fled to Los Angeles. Decades later, she still withholds from speaking English, and only the fertile names of flowers have taken root. I have not spoken to my mom in 2 years. Today, I visited her in the backyard. She is edging the lawn and planting strands of razzleberry fringe flowers. Next door, the chartreuse golden feather farewell. Here and there in the window's glow, I watch. She is luminous. This reflection is maddening. None of us aware of each other's ordinary death. Her blackish hair against the philodendron, long and parted in the center. I lose her in the shade of an overgrown bougainvillea hanging onto the hillside behind the house. The horizon waves in lines of barberry and nettles, silver waves of wild deergrass. I'm going to pause here to share a different direction that the next few poems kind of take. I write a lot about my mother, and my mother is and religion and the natural world are all somehow bound together for me. There's a certain magic in the natural world as I perceive religion to be a type of magic. You just have to have faith in nature as you do in religion. And so as I got older and moved away from religion, I found myself encountering much more challenging situations. And I began to write about the people that I encountered. And sometimes those people were good people who taught me about myself. And sometimes they were people that really made me appreciate my own place in the world and how fortunate and lucky I am to simply be alive. These next few poems are about different relationships I've had as a gay man, and really trying to understand how our society, culture has really become much more open to accepting different types of identities, which wasn't always the case when I was growing up. I was a teenager in the 90s, and it was quite difficult to be an out person. And there was still a very heavy stigma on being a gay person, on being queer. It was closely associated with HIV and AIDS. There's an entire generation of people who died in the 80s that are no longer, that have left a big gap in the gay community. Those people today would be in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. There's a great book that's written by Rebecca Mackay about this period in Chicago, and Sarah Schulman has written a great book about it as well. Emily Bass just wrote a book about, surprisingly, the impact that George W. Bush has had on research for HIV/AIDS. His presidency and as a president, he invested more in research for HIV/AIDS than any other president had, despite the fact that he did some other really awful things. But these poems are focused on queer identity and HIV/AIDS. This next poem is called Decomposition. In this blood that haunts my skin, in the folds of my brain are burrowed the harrowed words to describe you. Bleak, cursed, and when the universe was young, it possessed the means to give you breath, to deliver you to me. On this last day, you'd stumbled half alive onto the drawn curtain in the corner of your room. We watched ghostly orbs of light one last time, drifting in like laughter. An ice cream truck's siren song shook you back to life from the hunger of heroin. Outside, children passed. Photographs browned like honey from years of smoke covered the walls. I watched you from your bed where so many worlds undressed beneath the sap-like weight of phosphorus. Could the periodic table offer much more? Already, you were sulfur, even gold. Trickle down. This is how the dream begins. I stand on the lawn and watch my mother in a crowd. A girl in a black dress waits at the corner. She crosses the street. My eyes blur. Tires and birds dart into trees. Cars begin to lose their slack. It's Mary. I see her body flail into a crowd of children standing tightly tucked up close to my mother. Mary's face is pale, like the color of milk. Her dress is asphalt. Her eyes roll. I am 7. Our class attends her funeral. I wish it were a dream, and only after thousands had died, then finally did President Reagan say AIDS. I am 10 when Rock Hudson dies. There is no funeral. He quietly turns to ash. This is called With a Line by Paul Monette. Paul Monette is was a poet who published was actively publishing in the 1970s and 80s, and then in the 90s wrote nonfiction. And his 1992 memoir, Becoming a Man, was recognized and awarded a National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography, with a line by Paul Monette. The night we met, I smoked a pack of Camel Crush cigarettes on the porch with you. That weekend, I had my first Bellini. We drink iced tea by the pool. We swim beneath tantrums of cicada colonies in the cypress trees. That summer, we had BTK, then Dahmer, and Gacy, and the Doodler. Earlier today, while you were at work, I learned another way to leave you. I do laundry, I take a Xanax, and I fold a syringe and tourniquet into a drawer. So I'm going to read the poem that was mentioned during the introduction, the poem for Charlie. This too has been revised. I revised it because I wanted to tell more of a story. I wanted to add a little more context about Charlie. So Charlie was a real person. Charlie was someone I met when I lived in West Texas. West Texas is where I went for my doctoral program. I was at Texas Tech. And having grown up in Los Angeles, going to Texas was the last thing I imagined I would ever do. And surprisingly, Lubbock, Texas, where Texas Tech is a tiny little blue dot in the Panhandle. And Charlie was an outlier in West Texas. He was from the area. He grew up somewhere between Lubbock and Amarillo. They're just off the same highway. They're about 90 miles or so apart. And he was an interesting guy. And I moved to Illinois after grad school, after being in Texas. And we kept in touch. And then one day he just stopped communicating. And I didn't know what had happened. And, life goes on sometimes and you lose touch with old friends. But I was able to get a hold of his niece, who I'd met, and he talked about a lot. He loved his niece. She loved theater. And so Charlie and I loved theater as well. And so she would come up a lot in our conversations. And I learned from his niece that he had died. He had gone away on business in Austin. He was in the healthcare industry, and he just didn't show up for a meeting. And they'd found him in his hotel room. He'd passed away in his sleep, and he was in his 40s, so he was very, very young. So this is called For Charlie. It was winter. I called with no excuse except to listen to you say my name with your West Texas twang. You were a pig and you loved it. Weeks after I moved away, I dreamt of you. We'd fallen asleep with the radio on. The next morning you slept in, and the radio said that even the sun sets on paradise. I listened to the low, slow note of your exhale. Your snores and moos and woes filled the house like an oboe's mumble, warm and cuddly. The night before, you read to me by candlelight, your voice cool and easy. This morning, I almost called. I don't want to believe that you won't answer. The body is a charming instrument. I remember how your skin sagged like the arms of a tulip tree. On a different night, I dreamt of the ocean. I watched it unravel into the horizon, low and wide, like a green gauze pockmarked with seaweed and garbage. This morning, I awoke covered in sweat, my heart racing. From beyond the ramshackle fence in the backyard, a whippoorwill kept me calm. There is no reason to lie to you. I have been dying since we met. Do I have time for a couple more?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. And I also put the poem in the chat on Zoom, and it's at the Poetry Foundation if the YouTubers want to look at it. Did I hear you correctly that you got rid of the word ramshackle?
It's there. I
Okay,
got
it's
rid
in a
of
different place.
It is. I did get rid of some things, and we can certainly talk about that.
Okay, go on and read a couple more then.
Okay. I'm going to read two more. I'm going to read one that's a bit unusual for me. It's I have one poem like it. It's kind of an ars poetica where, you know, it's very self-conscious about itself. And it's kind of fun to do that. But I'd like to read one about one that's a little bit incorporates religion and nature again. And this is called At This Time of Year. My shirt is wet nearly every day. The summer simmers in patches of rain, and I can't escape it without a sweat. Today, I board the express train, and the subway car rails into a turn as the sun needles at my neck. We dive down into a tunnel buried deep like the dead. I hear a voice that says, "Last night, I waited on the side of the road for rescue after running out of gas. I thought about that time before solar winds turned oceans to fire. Lord," she said, "take us from this place to a place where the blue anemone of dusk light falls over a skyline of high rises." I waited beneath a moth-filled oak as headlights approached. I watched an owl forego the threshold of the train tunnel, its body bulging, wings homologized, splintered in the amber gleam of streetlights. The starlings resumed their careless scribbles in the bald sky. And this will be my last poem. This is called Poetry is Bourgeois. On the way home from work on the northbound train, I hear a young woman say, "Poetry is meant for the rich. Poetry is for the privileged. Poetry is for those who can spend time writing words meant for change. It is a life carelessly spent writing. This is a lie." Thank you.
Fantastic. And I think it's very important that it's the northbound train, given my recollections of Chicago. I'm glad you looped back to the religion and nature connection, because my colleague Brian Glazer, who is a fantastic poet in his own right and also working in areas of environmental justice, is interested in hearing more about your comment that you have to have faith in nature as you do in religion. He thinks that's deep and helpful, which is great that he understands it. Can you talk a little bit more about this similarity in having faith in nature and in religion?
Absolutely. There's something really interesting when considering the tradition of and evolution of poetry, and how language and perspective evolves and is influenced by society, by the world we live in. And I think about my own practice and how we're living in this. It's important to acknowledge that we live in a post 9/11 world, and I say that because I'm reminded of the world that poets who came before us, who are alive now, how catastrophic events have really influenced how we see the world and how we think about ourselves in the world. I'm thinking specifically about a collection of poetry that I don't think can be separated from what was happening at the time. And I'm thinking about T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets. So it was the quartets were written over the period of a number of years during World War II. And I'm not an Eliot scholar, but it's really clear to understand the influence of global events, whether it's a global pandemic or a world war, and how those events can really have an impact on what it means to be alive for a person. In the early and mid 20th century, the advent of technology was primarily used against other people during war, and we can see the anxiety that poets have, particularly in work in the 1950s, late 1940s, when atomic bombs were being tested, or when we dropped atomic bombs on people, and so there was this. I certainly have this anxiety about the impact of technology for good, and how technology can wipe us out. So in thinking about the relationship that I have to technology, technology is something that I value and that I embrace, and I've embraced it, having grown up during the proliferation of the internet. And I imagined technology one way. So, for example, over the last year, we've all, for the most part, been hunkered down, and we've lived our lives in this way through screens. And when I was young, very young, and the internet was very young, this is exactly the way I imagined the future. I imagined us doing everything on screens. And so I'm completely comfortable in this. I have, for me, the future is here. But one thing that I do miss is the connection to other living things, flora and fauna. And so it's really important to have faith in each other, and have faith that there are people who are good, and there are people who believe in the longevity of humanity, and despite the bad things that can come out of progress and technology. There's a great essay by Ann Townsend called "The Technological Sublime," which I think really speaks to this. It's in an edited collection that she and David Baker put together called "The Radiant Liar." But in the same way that I have faith in humanity, and the way T.S. Eliot had faith in humanity and expressed that in his collection, the Four Quartets, that idea of faith, it's most inherent in me because of the way I grew up. And I grew up in a religious household. And so when I think about faith and I think about having faith in something, the first thing that I ever had faith in was religion. That's the first place I learned about faith. It's the first place I really understood what it meant to believe in something outside of myself, something that exists somewhere in the ether. And when I go outside, I have faith that the sun will be there. I have faith that the sky above will be there. Even though I know that there are people on this planet who, don't want that for, a group of people or a country, or have these ideological differences that really want to erase cultures or communities. But the relationship that I see in nature and religion is quite similar. It's something that I know exists, and that I hope and I have faith that it will be there when I step out next time. And I find, Einstein said something about having this faith in something greater than himself. And, and I believe that for him, that faith was in science. And so when I think about how faith functions, my faith is in the natural world. And as a poet, I look to the natural world because it's something that I inherently believe will always be around.
So now you have me thinking about how I grew up in Catholicism too, and the connections that might have to the way I think about language, in addition to this issue of faith. And I'm wondering if we could get back to some of the language issues. And certainly I welcome questions from others in the Zoom room too. But Catholicism for me was so steeped in ritual and repetition. And then in high school, I studied Latin, and studying a different language than I already knew helped me think about the structure of language. And Latin is one of those languages where the verb comes at the end, which still boggles my mind. I mean, how can you follow a sentence if you don't know what the action is until it's over? So I think that it made me question, one right way of doing a sentence and how sentences are structured, which I attach to religion, but might be just knowing language in a different way. Can you talk about how you think about maybe the sentence and the poem's lines, or syntax and structure related to poetry?
It's interesting. I've been trying to teach myself Latin, and it's an interesting language. I think I'm just drawn to Romance languages. I've studied Italian and French, and I grew up speaking Spanish. And the phrase that I just keep thinking about is mihi nomen est or nomen mihi est. Yeah, it's just an easy one to remember. But you were describing that block of text from For Charlie, and when I wrote the poems in Revelations. As I was putting that together, I attended a talk, a reading by the poet Ellen Bass. Her book Headwaters had just been released, and she said something that I found fascinating. She'd her work is very musical. There's a really, I think, distinctive rhythm and sound in her work. And she said that when she was putting Headwaters together, that she decided to abandon all punctuation. And I always saw that as something that was experimental or transgressive in some way. And so, someone who really likes to write prose poems, sentences are important. And so abandoning punctuation altogether, I couldn't understand how I would make that work. But I just kept playing with, with the sentence, and I kept playing with ways to read something. I'm reminded of a book that was written by Robert Pinsky in the late 90s called The Sound of Poetry. And in it, he begins this book, which is focused on sound, rhythm, meter. And he says that we shouldn't teach meter. We shouldn't teach prosody to. We don't need to, because the English language or learning English inherently makes you able to write in this way. And I completely disagreed with that, because I grew up speaking Spanish at home, and so acquiring the English language was challenging, and I didn't hear the same cadence as whatever Robert Pinsky imagines should be there when you learn English. I just didn't hear that, and so when I started removing punctuation, I started thinking about the breath and how the breath functions when you're reading. And as you can tell, when I read poetry, something that I like to project, and I take on a particular cadence and rhythm when I'm reading, and that's because I try to really pay attention to the diction, and it's really important for me to try to find words that somehow cascade. There's this kind of a waterfall effect that I really love. If you want to, I think the best way to describe it is, I think about like a dactyl, right? Like this triple rhythm, triple beat. I think it's like long followed by two short accents, and you'll find it in, like, if you want to hear it in popular culture, one of the best examples of that rhythm is the Beatles song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." I mean, it's just all over the place there. There's, it's all dactyls. And one of the things that I really like about that, and I mentioned that I really like music, is that you can write a phrase, you can write a sentence and not include any punctuation in it, and it's still clear depending on how you form that sentence, right? The way Latin works is, you can move things around, but it still makes sense. And you can still make sense of something that's being communicated without having any punctuation. And for me, the sentence versus the line, I really like using sentences, but only when there's a moment of when I want the reader to read slowly. I think there's this understanding that the longer the line, the slower you are in reading something. And I think that has to do with the way we acquire language, the way we learn how to read. If you have a longer line, you're going to read it in a more natural style versus line breaks, or having shorter lines, or having unpunctuated lines. If they're shorter, you're going to you're going to pause more often. And so in creating these blocks, I really wanted readers to revisit the text, because it could be read in a number of different ways depending on how you normally read. And I think that's what's really fun and about writing without punctuation is, it's almost like a game. You're giving the reader. I'm giving the reader something to play with, in the same way that I play with language on the page. Now the reader has to attempt to read this block of words and make sense of it. And you can go back and sometimes you can read something completely different because there is no punctuation. There are no rules. And I think that's what's really great about being a maker, right? Like I think about a sculpture or a ceramicist who creates something out of nothing. I think that's just magical. And I find poetry to be quite similar. You can take these letters and put them together and make something sound really great. And then you put those letters together next to other letters, and it makes meaning somehow. And so, I know that it's probably really reductive you to think about language, but I think it's just amazing that we can make things out of nothing in that way.
My colleague Logan S. Dale, who is a poet and a scholar, has a question, and I'm wondering, Logan, if you're able to unmic and ask the question yourself, or if I should ask the question. Oh, I think he can go to the mic himself.
Hello, can you, where's a microphone? I have no idea.
We can hear you just fine.
Oh, you can, all right. Thank you, Ruben. It's, lovely to hear your poems and to hear your thoughts along with them. I posted a comment, just was struck by resonance perhaps with Rilke's first Duino elegy. And it's, is it an immortal first line or something? Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angels' hierarchies? And being clasped by something that you didn't know really, whether it existed or not, the terror of that moment, etc. And I was thinking of the first poem you read, which I think was called Honeysuckle. And there was a cluster of animals, I think, talks. I forget which, I'm sorry. And the last bit was only what I wrote down, only to be concerned with themselves. And I take it that you're interested in that issue of faith, right? That someone will respond, that something will respond perhaps and take you by surprise. So it's not so much a question as a response. And I feel like this might be in the same field that you're playing in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up. I've been reading a lot of, I took a seminar earlier this year with Mark Wunderlich on Rilke. He had a correspondence course. I think like hundreds of people took it, and it was all on Zoom. But we read almost, we read the majority of the major works by Lorca or by Rilke. I'm sorry, and I've always been interested in Rilke. I've read Rilke for a long time, as many of you probably have. And so, that certainly has influenced me. But when I was thinking about that ending, I was thinking about, I had been reading some work by Richard Wilbur, who, has a lot of music in his work. But that ending, I was really thinking about William Carlos Williams, his Bruegel poem, right, where you see this landscape with the Fall of Icarus. You see the people on land, completely just concerned with their own lives, while in this ocean, you see the Icarus's feet coming out of the ocean. And we all know the Icarus myth, hopefully. And so I was thinking about how we're attuned to one another, and whether it's people or just animals. And so, I started thinking about what was happening in this poem, and this image that I had of I actually had an image of a painting in mind, which is Antillean landscape. Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on maybe it's a Chagall poem or Chagall painting. Chagall had these really like wild, surreal paintings, but this Antillean landscape painting was a country, a rural landscape. And so I began to imagine this rural place, similar, I suppose, to the Bruegel painting, and just thinking about the relationship that we all have to not only to the natural world, but to the creatures in the world around us, and how we care for each other, or don't. And so that ending really, I think, really just struck me when I started thinking about the lives of creatures around me. It's been said that plants feel things as well. There's this great episode of Radiolab, which is a podcast called Colors. It's from years and years ago, and and it really plays with this idea of how we use language and how we see the world. But if you flash forward in the same podcast, there's another episode about trees and how trees communicate with roots. I'm sure many of you have heard this, but it's this great idea that like we're not alone. We're whenever we think like, are we alone in this universe? We certainly think about like extraterrestrials, but we're not alone on this planet, and I think we really forget that. So I'm thinking about my relationship to other creatures in the world.
All right. I think we'll wrap this up here. I did put the Radiolab episode into the chat for those who are in the Zoom room, and the rest of you can Google that, Radiolab and colors. I want to thank Ruben Quesada for being here this afternoon. I know you have to go off and teach your own class, and then you will be rejoining us at 7:15 our time in California, and that's pretty late for you in Chicago, probably 9:15 if I've done the math correctly. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing your poems, and also especially for contextualizing them in your own writing life and connecting them to the larger literary culture. That I really appreciate that kind of complexity of this event and this conversation. So with that, I will thank everyone